All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Bitcoin Magazine live stream. Today we're joined by the infamous forecaster and Bitcoin extraordinaire, Tuur Demeester. Tuur, thank you for joining.
Hi, David. Happy to be here.
So I wanted to have you be a part of this because I read something that you published this year that I found very interesting called the Bitcoin Reformation. And I'm a big believer that when you look back at history, you can tell a lot about what's happening in the future and what's happening today. The pattern kind of repeats. So, Tuur, talk to me about what is the Bitcoin Reformation? What's this framework that you've developed?
Yeah, well, the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago was all about kind of challenging the monopoly of the Catholic Church, and I think today what's being challenged is the monopoly in finance, the monopoly of the international financial system. And with that, I mean, of course, central banking and centrally issued currencies. And I think that we'll see, some more parallels than just that. It eventually led to freedom of religion, which was kind of unthinkable for many years before. And I think similarly, what we'll see is like this freedom of money, where the countries that allow for everyone to use whatever money they want to are going to do amazingly well.
So, in your mind, what was the kind of key innovation that came about that proliferated this change?
Well, so back then, it was the printing press that was invented, which reduced the price of a book from a year's labor to the price of a chicken in 100 years' time. So huge revolution. All of a sudden, ideas could spread like wildfire, and advances in navigation. It was kind of like a compounding amount of things. And I think now the innovation is really, it started with the internet, and now Bitcoin is adding to that. And also, of course, cryptography, which is a very defensive technology that people can use, like millennials and people who are excited about this freedom of money. They can start using that and basically kind of create new institutions.
So, one of the things I found most interesting about your piece is the parallels between the innovations that we have today that you just kind of highlighted. We have our modern printing press, it's the computer. We have our modern double entry accounting system, it's the triple entry accounting system. And the fusion of these technologies together are what, changed society. I'm curious to hear your thoughts of, do you see these technologies as individual developments that happened in kind of a silo, or do you think that these are fundamentally tied together? Like, did the printing press necessitate the need of the double entry accounting system?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, yeah, in a way, yes, because the printing press allowed for ideas to spread more quickly, and so then all of a sudden you could hear like, oh my God, in Venice they're specializing in this, and I'm very good at this, so I can travel down there, or they're discovering new places on the planet, and all of a sudden we're running a business and we want to go international. So the first multinational companies were from that era, like the Medici Bank, but others as well. And so then it's like, okay, well, how the hell do you run an international operation when you can't just pick up the phone? So that's when this accounting became more and more important. So yeah, it's true. It's like the germs were often already sown, but then what allowed them to sprout was that in other areas there was innovation. And so similarly, with the internet, yeah, cryptography has been around for a long time, but now there's more and more of a need for people to start using it. There's actually money behind the demand. So it's weird how this, sometimes there's ideas that have been existing for hundreds of years, but they need a certain fertile soil to really kind of grow fast and become ubiquitous.
Yeah, no, I think if you look at the advancement of society as a whole, you have permissionless information, you have permissionless trust. And, I thought a compelling part of kind of your framework was permissionless violence, and you use the word defense. I think that's a better term than violence, but the musket is the cannon of the individual, rather than just leaving the cannons with the king.
That's
Speak to that about how important self-sovereign protection and defense of your individual ideas is to this reformation or revolution being able to happen, this intellectual revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like, and the cypherpunk, their initial kind of the reason why they existed was because they said, we're technologists, we're really good at this, we can kind of make things happen in the digital realm. Is there a way for us to help people just protect their own rights without having to kind of petition the government or go in the street and protest? And so this idea that you could just kind of, you know, put together something of value and then put a lock and a key around it with cryptography is just so, yeah, so powerful. And I think important, and it's just beginning. I think this is just the very, very beginning, where with Bitcoin is the first time that you can actually have liquid value that then can be wrapped in this cryptographic envelope, so to speak. And then it's like with multi-sig and with time locks, like it's just mind-boggling the amount of security that you can, as an individual, as a very weak individual with no cannons or muskets or anything, that you can achieve. It's mind-boggling, and I think it's really going to revolutionize how wealth is stored and allocated, and how society is organized to some extent.
So I can get you on the record. Who is the cypherpunk of the 1500s?
Oh, like that. I can't name an individual really, because it was a lot of people. But like I would say, like, props to the guys in Holland who were like, you know, not only had they built all these dikes, but then they also had this idea like, well, you know, if the Spanish come, what we'll do is just we'll breach our own dikes and we'll flood them, and it worked amazingly well. Like like people don't realize, but the Spanish army, it was the most powerful empire in the world. So it's as if the entire U.S. army is invading Holland. Like really, it's kind of this incredible David against Goliath, and they stood their ground for 80 years. It was just incredible, and that's because they used water in a very inventive way. And I think the analogy to me is like cryptography is similar, where, you know, with not a lot of means, but by being really smart, you can actually stand your ground against very, very large forces.
You know, something that is, I think, interesting when you look historically at history, especially this time period, but that we haven't yet seen play out today, is the transformation that society goes under when they are given these new tools and new powers. And, you know, Europe transformed dramatically, but even the places that were early to adopt this technology, so you mentioned the Netherlands, the Dutch, you know, their society was very different from kind of what was the typical society of, you know, the day. And we're kind of the outcasts of society. I mean, there were refugees fleeing France and Spain, etc. So, you know, talk about how did Europe change societally? What cultural values shifted? And, you know, do you have any kind of forecast on what that means for what we should expect in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it's so kind of fascinating how like a little tiny group of people really had this huge impact on culture and society. And you know, I think the story shouldn't be just the Netherlands, because of course they did stand their ground, but a lot of Dutch and Flemings, they fled to the, you know, what's now the UK. And also they were one of the earliest, you know, discoverers, like the I forget now, the Bay Company that kind of discovered Canada, Hudson Bay. Those were Flemings and Dutch, and then of course the guys who landed on Manhattan Island, they were Dutch. And what was different about them is that they were not religiously motivated. They weren't saying like, you know, Catholicism is wrong, this new religion is right, and we're gonna just, you know, heaven on earth is gonna be this, you know, environment, this colony is going to be, you know, there were a lot of projects like that in the US. But what was unique about Manhattan was just, it was simply a trading post. Like they were just these pragmatic traders, these merchants, and they cared about a market that functioned. And so they decided that it doesn't make sense to religiously prosecute people, and they would allow in the Jews and they would allow in the Muslims. And that was the foundation of literally what's New York City now, like the most powerful city in the world. And so I think people now already talk about like, oh, like the Bitcoin citadel, like this idea of like the city on the hill. And I don't know if it's going to be a physical place, but really I think that there's like a similar pragmatism that can really lead to some just incredible innovation. I mean, look at it's just, you know, not to point at this one company, there's many, but for example, Bitfinex, I think they should earn some props for like being very innovative in very adversarial circumstances, and creating products to not only serve the customers, but help themselves survive. And, it's kind of reminding me of these Dutch little towns in the Protestant Reformation that were under siege by the Spanish. For example, they were issuing bonds. It's like they're issuing loans to not only the people that lived there, but also the other Dutch. And that not only, was a profit motive for the people investing in them, but of course it helped these little cities survive because then they could fortify their walls, etc. So it's interesting to me how like some of these, people kind of mock these exchange tokens and things like that, but I think there is some significant innovation there. And of course, we're going to see a lot more innovation in like in custody. I think that, the Bank of Amsterdam was really famous in the 1600s, because it was a full reserve gold bank. It was one of the most secure banks in Europe. And so I think similarly, there's such a contrast thinking of traditional banks versus these Bitcoin custody companies, Bitcoin banks, really. I'm very, optimistic about what that's going to bring.
It's interesting, the analogy of really blowing up the monopoly that was the Catholic Church over religious ideas. And I think that sometimes people can think of religious ideas as like fantasy, but I think that misses the larger picture of, really religion is about passing down ideas over generations, culturally and through mythology, that otherwise get lost to time. And so, when you took away power from the Catholic Church over what religion meant, you really took their control over the culture away, their control over what ideas are considered valid and invalid. So, today, I feel like if we were looking for the modern equivalent, it really is the political establishment or the academic establishment. It's some sort of institution today that controls what thought is acceptable and what thought is not, and the cultural values of our society. When the Catholic Church lost that power, they didn't give it up freely, and they didn't go, quietly into the night, so to speak. What did that change look like? Was it violent? Were there people who were specifically targeted? And what lessons can we distill from that today? Like how the establishment will react to losing their control, their monopoly.
Right. Yeah, you're talking about the counter Reformation, which did happen. Like basically, the Catholic Church was being caught. Like they were not only a monopoly, but they were kind of abusing the extent to which they had a monopoly. They were, for example, one of the most egregious projects was the St. Peter's Cathedral, which is of course a marvel to go there and see it. But they're literally kind of manipulating people of faith all across Europe by saying like, look, if you really want to get into heaven, you got to pay more, and you need to like pay the priests more, and then eventually that went to the Vatican, and it was even you could even I don't know, improve the situation of your loved ones who had already deceased. Like there was this kind of whole elaborate, almost like a scam going on. And so they of course,
as all great monopolies become, they
yeah, of course. Yeah, you just abuse the power because you feel entitled eventually.
and who can stop you? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Who's going to stop me? But so the Protestants were kind of like, we can just read the Bible ourselves. We don't need all this infrastructure. We'll find our own way into heaven. Like, don't worry about us. And so of course the Catholic Church was insulted, and so they had like an intellectual campaign. They had the a kind of a new order. I think it was mostly the Franciscan order who was like more intellectual, and they were kind of like trying to come up with their own arguments of why the Catholic Church was still right to do all that. And also they were like, they kind of reined it in a bit. So they had more austerity, where like they were trying to show like, look, we are still important. And so in a way their services were cheapened over time. Which you're also kind of seeing in the central banking world, where they're talking about we're going to do our own digital currency, and they don't really know what it's just very confusing. And it was similarly back then, as like they're just kind of scrambling to come up with a narrative. But then also, of course, they had their ties into the political infrastructure. And so, for example, in Spain, they would basically collaborate with the government to start prosecuting people who were heretics, and who were not part of the Catholic Church. And so, it's conceivable that, like, banks and banking lobbyists are going to try and push the government, and probably will be successful in several countries, push the government to go against Bitcoin adoption and try to fearmonger, or try to, like, come up with ideas to just dissuade people from using Bitcoin for all kinds of ways. And so that's why one of the conclusions of the report, because I think this is a valid parallel, is that Bitcoin tolerance or intolerance is going to be a major political fault line. And it could even run, for example, in the US, it could run through the country. It could be that, like, New York State is going to be violently against Bitcoin, and then other states are going to be very friendly. Like, it really is possible that political unions are broken up over this.
So, from when Martin Luther kind of nailed his treatise, I don't know the right term, up on the door, to when
The 95 Theses.
To when society fundamentally had been transformed, and it was clear to all that the Catholic Church was not the same as it was before. How much time expired? Like, what was it? Did it take 100 years? Did it take 50 years? Did it take 200 years?
I would argue it was very, very heterogeneous, the process. So in certain countries, like, US was pristine. So, in a way you could argue, for New York City, it was 100 years. It was very, very fast. And then for France, for example, you could argue, like, maybe it was, like, all the way to the start of the French Revolution, which is like the 1700s, like 250 years, to, like, finally for the Catholic Church to, like, take it down a notch. And it doesn't mean that things improved, but still, like, to end that monopoly to some extent. So that's why this fault line is going to be important, and it could be one of our personal life decisions, where, like, where do I want to live? And I'm not going to judge anyone for staying in a country that's Bitcoin unfriendly, because there's so many reasons to choose where to live. But I do think it'll be one of the factors on especially young people's mind, is like, I want to start a business or something like that. Like, where do I want to live? Let's go to this Bitcoin friendly place maybe. But again, it could be in the cloud as well. And so who knows, like, if a country that's Bitcoin friendly still to some extent respects people's privacy, who knows, maybe you could do fine.
Yeah, if the parallel is who controls the monopoly, it's like, the dollar is the monopoly and the US government controls it. And, it's hard to see any person in control of the system giving that up easily. And so it's like, I wonder if the places where this technology will proliferate the most, or the change will happen the quickest, will be the places that are outside of the US dollar hegemony, outside of, the political apparatus of the American empire.
It seems possible, or even likely, but there's a bunch of scenarios that you can imagine where, because it's tempting, right? It's such good money. And so, like, you can imagine, think about Bitcoin, like, doing another 100x. So we're talking about a trillion plus market cap. And then you have companies, and they start kind of lobbying the government in certain ways, or the government is like, you have to imagine society keeps changing, and we are going to face a fiat crisis. Like, it's kind of a little bit different from the Catholic Church 500 years ago, because this collective, like, people didn't lose their faith overnight. Like, it wasn't like that. So there was this slow erosion of kind of faith in the Catholic Church, but not like religiosity didn't really disappear. For that took, like, the atheism only came in maybe 100 years ago. But so today, if the dollar starts inflating, like, that is a very kind of economic, very real deflation of faith. Like, all of a sudden it's like, the curtain is pulled out of your eyes, and it's like, this is a scam, or what's going on? Was not supposed to happen, right? The dollar was strong. So I think that could really accelerate things. And then you have to think from the position of a politician. It's like, okay, you really have a tax income problem. Like, we saw that with the disintegration of the USSR, Russia, where the ruble was hyperinflating, and they had a huge problem raising taxes, because it's one of the hardest thing in the world. If you're a government and you're facing hyperinflation, how do you get income? How do you get the money to trickle up and still have some value? And so that's where it could be that they are actually going to just allow companies and individuals to pay their taxes in Bitcoin. Well, and then it's very hard to ban something that you rely on for your subsistence. So like, those things are, and also like, there are states, the US is an energy producer. There are states that are going to have substantial Bitcoin mining industries. And also like, think about the other countries like Brazil and other energy producing countries. They're going to be Bitcoin friendly probably. Anyway, so there's a lot of variables, and I think it's too early to really know. But you're right. I mean, it's kind of saying like, how long did Italy take to kind of let go of their Catholicism? A long time, because the Vatican was in Italy. So I think it's a great point. It's definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think the USSR example is such an interesting example because it parallels our experience so well in many ways. But the one difference is that there was an alternative system that was viable for people to offboard into. And so it wasn't, like when the USSR and the United States were head to head, they each had their own kind of universes that they were, king of their own universe. And when the USSR collapsed, now we have the system where there's like one universe. And there really isn't, as far as I can see right now, a viable alternative other than things like Bitcoin, but that things that need much more time to evolve and to advance before they're like ready for prime time. It's like, what is the alternative system for people to check into?
Yeah. So and like the way the French Revolution happened was, and I'm working on a piece on this, is that so the first problem is debt. Like, like global debt is 350% of GDP. Like this is like just, even in the US, the debt levels were only like 100, 120. And I'm talking not only government debt, like all the debt combined is 350% GDP. The total debt in the US in the 60s even was below 150% of GDP. So just to give an idea, like this is mind-boggling, the debt. And so the debt is a problem. We need a debt jubilee. It has to be wiped out because there's no way anyone can pay it back. And so the currencies have to fail. That's how the debt gets wiped out. But so it's likely that as that happens, government's going to try and come up with some kind of stopgap measure to be like, okay, well, here's the currency. How about that? And I'm sensing that they're working on stuff that eventually is going to be like, well, we have this currency that's backed by something flashy and sexy, whatever. Like it's going to be like all the ETFs that we bought and everything that's on the central bank balance sheet. Like, yeah, this new currency and it's backed by it. But it'll be a joke because you won't be able to actually convert the whatever tokens for what's supposedly backing it. And that was the problem as well in France in the 1700s. They had a huge debt problem, and to kind of keep paying the debt, they confiscated the lands of the church, huge lands, goods. They confiscated them, and then they issued a token and said it's backed by the lands of the church, which was a joke because you could never redeem it. Like, so that went to zero. And I think maybe similarly, we'll have this kind of joke digital currency that's supposedly backed by all kinds of stuff, but people will see that it's just, and so maybe that'll whatever be 5 or 10 years of like, they're going to try that until eventually we have actual monetary. And so what saved France was they went back to a gold standard with Napoleon, who was actually paying the soldiers in real silver. And that's kind of where things started stabilizing again. So I think the solution to all this debt is first we need a jubilee. It has to be wiped out. And then we're going to go to hard money. And I mean, it's going to be a hell of a ride. I wish we could just fast forward because I don't think it'll be very pretty, but we just have to do it. And luckily, if you're in Bitcoin, you've bought insurance against exactly this kind of problem.
So Bitcoin is king when the military starts demanding payment in sats only.
That's a great summary. I totally agree. If soldiers get paid in Bitcoin, that means we're probably across the chasm somehow.
So one last note before we wrap this up. I feel like people, let's end on a positive note. So, people, I feel like lose perspective of how important Bitcoin is in the history and the how formative it is in human society as a whole. And, we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, but even if you go back one generation, like the creation of writing in the first place, the creation of sound money, a gold currency in the first place, the single ledger, you know, those innovations gave us a huge amount of technological change and really a golden age that came. You know, the Protestant Reformation, soon after, we had a golden age in enlightenment, in culture, in art. You know, we had new ideas like corporations that formed for the first time rather than just family businesses. All right, looking forward, you know, what does the golden age look like for the modern society? And, you know, do you think Bitcoin plays a key role in that?
Yeah, it gives me chills just thinking about it. Like that's really what keeps exciting me is that, what's gonna happen. I don't know which ideas, but certain ideas that are very minority, very fringe today, where a lot of the people who strongly believe in them, that they have so much value and who've been discouraged over and over, some of these ideas are gonna get huge platforms and we're going to see educational institutions being massively reformed, or even new ones that come out. Like that was part of, the revolution in the Protestant Revolution, was that all these new universities popped up and new ideas got, and of course there was like an amazing revolution in the arts as well, and in science. It's incredible stuff. And so similarly, like society is going to become less wasteful as a whole. And the people that call the shots, quote unquote, economically, the people with the wealth, it's going to be a different culture, because there's going to be this wealth transfer. I did some calculations a while ago, and just looking at like the ultra high net worth, population of the world. And of course, money is not everything, and it's not the people with the money that dictate everything. Like a lot of it is bottom up, but to some extent it makes sense to look at this little group. So there's about 20 million people around the world that have a net worth of over $50 million. If Bitcoin goes really to like $1 million, up to half of the world's wealthiest people could be Bitcoiners. Like that is a real possibility. And so in a way, all our little stupid memes and like all our jokes and like all our kind of, in a way it's the start of a culture, and it really could have a huge impact for the next hundreds of years. And so in a way, I think it matters a lot. If you're pursuing something intellectually, just keep going at it and just trust that over time you might have a much different platform to present these ideas to the world.
So Tuur, thank you for joining us. I can't imagine a better message to welcome in the next epoch in Bitcoin. And I look forward to seeing this new golden age unfold. Thank
Really,
you.
really exciting. Yeah, me too.